Hello everyone. Tonight we're talking about what it actually meant to be born a woman in an ancient tribe. And no, it wasn't the noble earth goddess fantasy people like to paint. From being left unnamed until you survived long enough to be worth the trouble, to bleeding in a hut while the rest of the village pretended you were radioactive, to grinding so much grain your bones still scream about it thousands of years later. This was daily life. So if that already sounds too cheery for bedtime, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy wandering into the darker corners of history with me. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you. I always love seeing just how many places and hours collapse into this little space we share. Now, dim the lights, pour yourself something warm, maybe let a fan hum in the background like the old night winds. We're going to step into a world where silence wasn't peaceful, fear was ordinary, and blood was everywhere. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Not the one born in a sterile hospital with soft lighting and jazz music in the background. No, imagine this. You're born on a dirt floor, your mother squatting because gravity does half the work, and the midwives humming chants they swear keep the spirits from stealing your first breath. Romantic. Only if you ignore the screaming, the blood, and the fact that childbirth was basically the Olympics of survival. Except the losers didn't get consolation prizes. They got buried. The truth is, being born female in ancient tribes was already a gamble. And not a fun one like rolling dice in Vegas. More like betting your life savings on a horse that might not even leave the stable. Female infants weren't always celebrated. In some places, you were swaddled and nursed. In others, you were quietly returned to the earth, which is a poetic way of saying abandoned or worse. Archaeological digs have turned up sites where infant bones tell stories parents didn't. That's the first thing you need to know. Survival wasn't guaranteed, and gender tipped the scales. But let's say you survived. Your mother had to survive too, and that was no small thing. Ancient childbirth was lethal. Without modern medicine, hemorrhage, infection, or obstructed labor could end her life before you even opened your eyes properly. Skeletons of prehistoric women show pelvic trauma, signs of repeated childbirth, and malnutrition. You'd think the gods would have offered a little leniency here. But apparently divine mercy had other priorities, like making sure the sun rose. If you did make it past those first brutal hours, congratulations. But don't uncork the mead just yet. You're still fragile, still one fever or one bad winter away from being a short footnote in your clan's genealogy. Infant mortality rates were staggering. Some estimates suggest half of children never reached age 5. So, your little cries in the night weren't just cute, they were warnings. If you stopped crying, everyone panicked. And oh, the welcome you got. Don't expect soft pink blankets and lullabies. What greeted you was smoke from the hearth, the smell of tanned hides, and the weight of a world that already knew exactly what it wanted from you. You weren't an individual. You were potential labor, future womb, another link in the fragile chain keeping the tribe alive. Someone probably whispered a blessing over you, but it was less about celebrating your existence and more about bargaining with unseen forces. Please don't take this one too. Even your name, if you got one at all right away, could be temporary. Many cultures delayed naming infants until they survived a few months, because why waste a good name on someone who might not make it through the season? It's a harsh logic, but practical. Nothing says ancient tenderness like treating a baby as provisional property until her odds improved. So here you are, a wrinkled, squirming, blood-smeared miracle that's already a political, spiritual, and economic question mark. Everyone's watching to see if you'll keep breathing, if your mother will stay alive, and if the spirits of the land will let you join the living. It's dramatic, yes, but also ordinary. For tribal women, birth was both a sacred rite and a statistical nightmare. And when you did survive, no one threw a party, no balloons, no cake, just a resigned nod, a swaddle of animal hide, and maybe a dab of protective paint or charm to ward off the things that wanted you gone. Because make no mistake, they always wanted you gone. Spirits, sickness, hunger, even your own relatives, if resources were scarce. Birth wasn't an arrival into safety. It was an initiation into risk. And speaking of risk, your childhood wasn't about dolls and naps. From your first shaky breaths, you were on a conveyor belt headed straight toward work, silence, and blood. But before that, let's linger a bit on childhood itself, where even the games you played weren't really games at all. If you'd been lucky enough to survive the gauntlet of birth, don't start thinking you'd get a carefree childhood out of it. Childhood as you know it, the cartoons, the sugary cereals, the moral panic about screen time didn't exist. In ancient tribes, childhood was less a phase and more a short probationary period before you were useful. Your first toddling steps weren't met with applause. They were a reminder that you could now carry small loads without being dead weight. Congratulations, you've been promoted from fragile liability to tiny worker. The toys. Oh, you had them. But they weren't toys so much as training manuals, disguised as objects. Little clay pots, miniature grinding stones, doll-sized tools carved from bone. Archaeologists have dug them up, and guess what? They're practice gear, not playthings. That tiny pot wasn't for pretend tea parties. It was to get your clumsy fingers ready for real pottery. The kind that might actually feed people or get you smacked for breaking. Your education didn't come from scrolls or schoolmasters, but from watching women older than you bend over grinding stones until their spines curved like bows. You learned to imitate them long before your muscles could handle the labor. Gathering plants wasn't a leisurely stroll in the forest. It was survival boot camp with your mother pointing out which leaves healed wounds and which ones sent you to meet the ancestors early. Even games had edges. Racing with other kids. It trained your stamina for long treks with water jars, playing with pebbles, a rehearsal for sorting grains. You didn't just make believe, you rehearsed the future job description of your gender. Your hands learned before your brain caught up. And yes, silence was part of the curriculum too. You didn't chatter during adult discussions. Children were to be seen, rarely heard, and preferably already useful. Anthropologists love pointing out that in many tribal societies, kids were integrated into work gradually, shadowing adults and picking up skills by imitation. It sounds lovely until you realize it also meant your mistakes could ruin dinner for the whole clan. No pressure, kid. Just don't mix up the edible roots with the ones that cause explosive diarrhea. There was tenderness, don't get me wrong. Mothers and grandmothers held you, fed you, whispered stories into your ear. But affection was practical. You were kept alive because survival was communal, not because anyone thought you were a snowflake, destined for unique greatness. You were valuable because you could one day carry water, tan hides, plant seeds, and give birth to more workers. It was love, but the kind that came with conditions. And speaking of conditions, let's talk about what you wore. Forget Instagrammable toddler outfits. You were either naked half the time or dressed in miniature versions of adult clothes. Sometimes with amulets hanging around your neck, charms against spirits, illness, or whatever invisible enemy haunted the community. Your body wasn't seen as innocent but as porous, vulnerable, a small doorway for unseen forces to wander in and out. And believe me, nobody wanted those forces wandering in. By the time you were 6 or 7, your role was clear. You belonged to the women's sphere. Boys might still roam between women's work and men's games for a while, but girls were pulled closer to the hearth, the fields, and the endless cycle of processing food, grinding, pounding, carrying, fetching. It's not glamorous, but without it, the tribe starved. Ethnographic records from groups as varied as the Hadza in Tanzania to the Yanomami in the Amazon show the same pattern. Women and girls produced the majority of calories through gathering and processing. So yes, while men got the heroic stories of hunting, women and their daughters quietly kept everyone alive. Childhood was short, functional, and always edging toward adulthood. You weren't waiting for puberty to flip the switch. You were already rehearsing womanhood every day, with tiny chores strung together like beads on a necklace. And speaking of beads, your first blood menarche would turn that necklace into a chain. So, you've made it through the fragile years, learned how to grind seeds without inhaling half the dust, and carried enough water jars to make your spine hum at night. Just when you think you've mastered childhood, your body decides to throw blood into the mix. Puberty arrives, and with it, menarche, that glorious first menstruation. The biological drum roll announcing, "Congratulations, you're officially useful in new and terrifying ways." In ancient tribes, that first drop of blood wasn't private. Oh no, it was everyone's business. Across cultures, from the Arctic to the Amazon, menarche was marked with ritual, seclusion, and a touch of fear. Why fear? Because menstrual blood wasn't just blood, it was power. Dangerous, polluting, sacred, pick your adjective. Anthropologists like to say menstrual practices reveal what societies really think about women. Spoiler, they were usually both fascinated and terrified of you. Some groups built menstrual huts or lodges, little spaces on the edge of the settlement where you'd spend days isolated, bleeding into moss or cloth, fed by older women who whispered rules you'd better follow. In some Native American traditions, menstruation meant retreating to a lodge to avoid contaminating hunting gear or sacred objects. In certain African societies, the logic was the same. Your blood could spoil food, weaken warriors, or anger spirits. You didn't argue with this. You sat in that hut, probably cold, hungry, and wondering why half the cosmos cared about your uterus. But here's the irony. While blood made you untouchable in a bad way, it also made you holy. In some Melanesian groups, the seclusion hut wasn't punishment, but a sacred chamber where older women initiated you into the mysteries of fertility, passing down herbal knowledge and survival wisdom. Blood was feared, but also revered. It linked you to life, to cycles, to cosmic renewal. Imagine being told you were simultaneously dangerous and divine. Welcome to womanhood. Of course, practical realities never took a holiday. Menarche meant you were now a candidate for marriage. Not in a few years, sometimes immediately. Among many patrilineal societies, puberty was the starting gun for negotiations, bride wealth, alliances, and fertility contracts. Your first blood wasn't celebrated as your own milestone. It was a signal flare to your clan that your reproductive potential had arrived on the market. Romantic, isn't it? And the rules, oh, the rules. Some cultures dictated you couldn't touch tools, others banned you from certain foods. Still others forced you into elaborate purification rituals after your cycle ended. Anthropologists have catalogued them like footnotes to female suffering. No cucumbers this month, no stepping across a hunter's bow, no bathing in the river at the wrong time, or else the fish gods might revolt. Your body wasn't just yours. It was a liability with its own calendar of taboos. And let's not forget the silence. Talking openly about menstruation wasn't an option. It was ritualized, whispered, wrapped in euphemism. You learned quickly not to complain about cramps or blood flow. Pain was private, managed through herbs, heated stones, or sheer endurance. What could you do? Moaning too loudly risked being accused of weakness or worse. Witchcraft. Better to bite your lip, sit in your hut, and wait for the blood to finish its monthly reminder that your life was no longer about you. By the time you stepped out of seclusion, you weren't a girl anymore. You'd crossed a threshold written not in ink but in blood. From now on, every cycle was a rehearsal for childbirth. Every drop a reminder of your role in keeping the tribe alive. And if you thought this was pressure, just wait until someone handed you a husband, sometimes a cousin, sometimes a stranger, and told you the real work of womanhood was about to begin. So, you've bled, you've been secluded, and you've re-emerged, blinking into the firelight, with everyone now eyeing you differently. Congratulations, you're officially sexual property. Not in the romantic you get to choose your soulmate sense, but in the deeply pragmatic, your body now belongs to the clan's diplomacy department sense. If you'd been born into an ancient tribe, your sexuality wasn't yours to explore. It was a bargaining chip, a family investment, a fragile jar passed carefully from one set of hands to another. Drop it, and everyone paid the price. Anthropologists call it reproductive control. But let's translate. People watched your body like it was the community granary. Virginity mattered, not because it was symbolic of purity in some modern moralistic sense, but because it was proof no rival lineage had tampered with the goods. In patrilineal tribes especially, the guarantee of paternity was everything. Land, cattle, names, they all needed heirs, and heirs required a womb whose history was documented like livestock. Marriage negotiations started young, sometimes immediately after your first period. In many societies, from the pastoralists of East Africa to agrarian communities in South Asia, the moment your fertility clock started ticking, so did the marriage clock. Courtship, forget it. Your romantic life was decided over bride wealth exchanges, cattle, beads, textiles, iron tools. If you were lucky, the trade meant your new husband's family had some wealth. If unlucky, you were shuffled off as a second or third wife, part of a household where hierarchy among women was another exhausting game you didn't sign up for. And your say in all this? Minimal. Silence was your contribution. You didn't protest, because protest was pointless or dangerous. In patriarchal tribal systems, women rarely had direct authority in council and negotiations. At best, an ant might whisper influence behind the scenes. But you were expected to obey, bear children, and not disgrace your kin. Sex itself wasn't yours either. Among the Yanomami of the Amazon, for example, girls were often promised in marriage long before puberty. In some groups, a girl's first sexual experience was with an older husband, chosen by family, not by preference. In pastoral societies, polygyny meant you might share that husband with 2, 3, or 10 other women, each vying for attention, resources, and survival. Romantic love, if it existed, was secondary to alliances and fertility. Of course, there were exceptions. Matrilineal or horticultural tribes sometimes granted women more autonomy. Among the Iroquois, women controlled property and had veto power in clan councils, and marriages could be dissolved more easily. But even then, sexuality was still a social asset more than a personal playground. Your womb was a lineage factory, and everyone had a stake in its output. And fear lurked everywhere. A misstep pregnancy outside of sanctioned marriage, flirtation with the wrong man, whispers of adultery could mean severe punishment. Some societies sanctioned beatings, others execution. More often, it meant public shame, ostracism, or being married off in haste to cover scandal. Skeletons tell their own dark footnotes, female remains with trauma marks, hints of violence tied not to raids but to domestic life. So, you learned to live guarded. Your body became a field constantly surveyed, not just by men, but by older women, by relatives, by the entire web of community expectation. You walked with your head bowed, you kept your laughter quiet, you never lingered too long near the wrong hearthfire. Every glance carried weight, every gesture was a potential rumor, and this was just the prelude. Because soon, your sexuality would be formalized in a marriage contract you didn't sign. Sealed not with ink but with cattle, cloth, and the blood of your first childbirth. And if you thought sex was about intimacy, you were about to discover it was mostly about alliances, debts, and heirs you were expected to produce on schedule. By now, your body isn't really yours. It's a ledger entry. And marriage, well, let's be honest, it wasn't about you finding the one. It was about your family finding a deal. Marriage in ancient tribes was less romance beneath the stars, and more how many goats can we squeeze out of this transaction. If you'd been born into it, your wedding day wasn't a fairy tale. It was a financial settlement disguised as a sacred ritual. Across the world, anthropologists have found the same pattern. Marriages in tribal societies cemented alliances, not hearts. Bride wealth in cattle, beads, or metal passed hands. Dowries in cloth, food, or labor obligations followed you like baggage. Your value as a bride was measured in resources, not in personality. You weren't beautiful or charming. You were worth 3 cows and a sack of millet. Try putting that on a dating profile. And don't imagine you had much choice in your new partner. In many patrilineal societies, your marriage was arranged by your father, brothers, or clan elders. A man's standing, his lineage, his ability to offer livestock or weapons, those decided your fate. Your feelings about the man, utterly irrelevant. If your mother offered quiet advice, it wasn't choose someone you love. It was try to pick the one who won't beat you too much and keeps enough food on the table. Practicality over passion, always. Polygyny added another layer of charm. Your husband might already have 2 wives before you, each older, more established, and very invested in reminding you of your place. Household politics became its own battlefield. Who controlled the food, who got more of the husband's attention, whose children were favored. Alliances weren't just between clans. They were negotiated daily inside polygynous compounds, with women competing for survival and status in a hierarchy that never really allowed friendship. And if you were in a monogamous system, don't relax yet. Marriage still wasn't yours. It bound families, not individuals. In some tribes, your marriage could be dissolved if alliances shifted. In others, widowhood meant being remarried automatically to your husband's brother, the infamous levirate marriage, found in Africa, Asia, and beyond. Romantic, only if you've always dreamed of marrying the guy who borrowed your husband's spear and never gave it back. The rituals around marriage told the same story. In some societies, women were carried or dragged to their husband's home, symbolizing the transfer of ownership. In others, they were veiled or hidden, as though their very identity was secondary to the transaction. Gifts were exchanged, animals slaughtered, beer brewed, songs sung, but every drumbeat emphasized the same truth. You were now part of someone else's household, your body conscripted into their lineage. And with marriage came pressure, fertility. You weren't married to be a companion, you were married to produce heirs. If months passed and no pregnancy arrived, whispers began. Was it you? Was it the husband? No one asked. Science. Blame usually landed on the woman. Infertility could mean beatings, abandonment, or replacement by another wife. Your worth was measured in womb output. Fail at that, and your dowry might even be demanded back. Nothing says true love like a refund policy. Marriage locked you into silence too. Your sexuality was now fully regulated by your husband's household. Your labor, your reproduction, your movements watched and controlled. Some women carved out spaces of power. Yes, older wives, mothers of many children, or women from prestigious lineages could wield influence. But for the young bride, marriage was more prison than palace. And that's the bitter truth. Your wedding wasn't the beginning of freedom. It was the official end of whatever scraps you had left. From here on out, your days were measured in labor, your nights in expectation, and your body and children produced. And oh, the labor, because, once married, you weren't just a wife. You were a worker, and your to-do list made the pyramids look casual. So here you are, married off, your reproductive calendar officially everyone else's business. And if you thought marriage meant long afternoons reclining while servants fed you figs, wrong civilization, wrong century, wrong planet. In tribal life, being a wife didn't exempt you from work, it doubled it. You weren't just expected to manage childbirth, you were also expected to keep the entire subsistence machine running. Let's talk about your day. It started at dawn, long before the men stirred. You were grinding grain on a stone that felt like it weighed more than your own body. Archaeologists love pointing out that women's skeletons from agricultural societies have wrists and knees worn down like factory parts. Why? Because they spent hours each day kneeling, pushing, grinding, turning hard grains into edible paste, while their joints screamed louder than any ritual chant. Think of it as CrossFit, but with fewer compliments and way more arthritis. After that came fetching water. Sounds romantic. Try carrying jars heavy enough to realign your spine, balanced on your head, across distances that would make modern marathoners complain. In societies without wells, women trekked miles daily to rivers or springs. Every step was functional cardio, every spill a risk to the family's hydration. Hydrate or dehydrate wasn't a catchy slogan, it was your reality. Food processing, 2-pounding roots, drying fish, fermenting beer, cooking meals. While men hunted once in a while and strutted back with a carcass sometimes, it was women's work that provided the reliable calories. Ethnographies like to remind us, in many foraging groups, women contributed up to 70% of daily food intake. But did anyone carve statues of women gathering berries? Of course not. Apparently, steady survival isn't as heroic as chasing an antelope you might not catch. And don't think the chores ended with food. You also tanned hides, scraping, softening, sewing until your hands blistered. You wove baskets and mats, spun fibers into thread, wove thread into cloth, bone needles, loom weights, spindle wurlsall, the little artifacts archaeologists keep finding. That's women's work fossilized in clay and bone. Men got buried with weapons, women with the tools that kept everyone clothed and alive. Guess which ones actually saw daily use? Childcare wasn't a separate category, it overlapped everything else. Babies strapped to your back while you pounded grain, toddlers trailing you to the fields, older children drafted into chores. Silence wasn't just cultural, it was survival. You kept babies quiet so predators or rival humans wouldn't hear. Rocking, nursing, whispering songs, multitasking before the word existed. And of course, your labor wasn't limited to your own household. In communal societies, women shared workloads together in fields, at rivers, around hearths. But this didn't make it easier. It made your exhaustion collective. Imagine rows of women bent over cassava or millet, singing to keep rhythm, each one silently calculating how many mouths she needed to feed at home. That wasn't just work. That was survival strategy disguised as community bonding. The body paid for it. Women's bones from Neolithic and Bronze Age cemeteries show stress markers, compressed spines, worn teeth from chewing fibers, arms with repetitive strain injuries. The evidence is so clear archaeologists can practically read a woman's job description from her skeleton. And still labor wasn't celebrated, it was expected. Work was invisible until it failed. Nobody praised you for grinding flour unless you stopped, in which case the tribe noticed because dinner didn't happen. Heroism was male, endurance was female. You weren't remembered for surviving 30 years of back-breaking tasks. You were remembered if you bore sons. So no, there was no rest. Marriage meant you worked harder, bled more, slept less, and as if endless chores weren't enough, your labor extended to the most dangerous job of all, carrying life inside you. Which means it's time we talk about pregnancy, not the glowing miracle you've been told about, but the terrifying gamble that killed countless women before you. If marriage had locked you into labor, pregnancy was the trapdoor beneath it. And let's be honest, it wasn't a beautiful journey. It was Russian roulette with 9 chambers loaded. Every pregnancy was a gamble, and the stakes were your life. You weren't glowing. You were swollen, exhausted, and praying your body didn't betray you. Without modern medicine, pregnancy was brutal. Women faced anemia, infections, miscarriages, stillbirths. Anthropologists studying skeletal remains have found endless evidence of stress pelvic deformities from too many births too close together, teeth stripped of enamel from nutritional deficiency, ribs showing lesions from repeated pregnancies, draining calcium out of bones. Your body wasn't just working overtime, it was being mined like a quarry, and spacing. Good luck. Sure, prolonged breastfeeding acted as natural birth control in some societies, but that only slowed things down. Without contraception, women spent most of their fertile years pregnant or recovering from pregnancy. In foraging societies, you might carry children farther apart because mobility limited how many you could physically manage. But in agricultural tribes, babies often arrived one after another, stacking like poorly planned dominoes. And each domino could kill you. Childbirth itself was a nightmare. Modern estimates suggest maternal mortality in tribal and early agrarian societies could reach 1 in 10 women per lifetime. Hemorrhage, obstructed labor, sepsis, any of these could turn childbirth into death. No sterile tools, no cesareans, no pain relief, just midwives, herbs, charms, and hope. In some cultures, if the baby presented wrong, women died simply because the tools to intervene didn't exist. It's no wonder so many female skeletons from the past show death in their 20s and 30s, the prime childbearing years. And it wasn't just physical pain, it was cultural weight. Your womb was everyone's business. Pregnancy confirmed your value. Miscarriage or infertility threatened it. If you carried to term, you were fulfilling your duty. If you didn't, suspicion brewed. Was it a curse? A punishment from the spirits? Had you broken some taboo during menstruation or pregnancy? In tribal logic, biology rarely got the blame, women did. Rituals surrounded it all. Protective amulets were tied to your belly. Songs were sung to coax the baby out. In some societies, men performed COVID imitating labor pains, or rituals to draw away bad spirits, which is equal parts touching and absurd. Imagine groaning through contractions while your husband fakes cramps in the corner for spiritual balance. Helpful, not really, entertaining maybe. And then there was blood. Birth blood, like menstrual blood, was seen as dangerous and sacred. Women gave birth, squatting, kneeling, or supported by other women, often in separate huts. Birth huts, like menstrual huts, sat on the edge of settlements, half sacred space, half quarantine zone. Your cries weren't private. Everyone knew when life or death was unfolding in those walls. For the lucky survivors, recovery wasn't downtime. You were back at work almost immediately. Anthropological records of subsistence tribes show women returning to fields or gathering within days or weeks of delivery. No postpartum leave, no baby showers, no casseroles from neighbors, just you, bleeding, sore, nursing, and still holding water. And the cruelest part, you could die giving birth to a child who didn't survive either. Infant mortality was astronomical. Half your babies might not live to age 5, so you kept getting pregnant, hoping one more might stick. Pregnancy wasn't a miracle. It was statistical persistence, and when you did survive with a living child, you still weren't safe, because childbirth was only the beginning. Next came the endless labor of keeping that fragile, screaming life alive in a world that seemed determined to snuff it out. So, you survived pregnancy. Congratulations, you've unlocked the bonus round, raising the baby. Except this wasn't a Hallmark commercial with soft lullabies and pastel cribs. Child rearing in ancient tribes was closer to a high-stakes survival game where the odds were rigged against you and the prize was simply keeping something alive. Infant mortality was vicious. In many tribal and early agricultural societies, half of children didn't make it to age 5. Diarrhea, fevers, infections, malnutritional, the invisible killers that now vanish with antibiotics or clean water, were everyday threats. Your baby could go from gurgling to gone in less time than it takes modern parents to Google teething remedies, which meant your whole day revolved around one thing: vigilance. Breastfeeding wasn't a choice, it was the only option. Wet nursing happened, sure, but usually within extended kin. Otherwise, it was your breasts or nothing. And nursing wasn't 2 years of gentle bonding, it could last 3, 4, even 5 years, both for nutrition and for that accidental birth control effect. Imagine working in fields, carrying firewood, and simultaneously feeding a baby clamped to your chest like a barnacle. Romantic. Only if you have a fetish for sleep deprivation. Older daughters were drafted into childcare almost immediately. Anthropologists call it alloparenting. Siblings, cousins, grandmothers, all pitching in. But make no mistake, it was still women's work. You didn't see teenage boys pacing with colicky infants. That was your job, or your sister's, or your mother's, and it was constant. A crying baby wasn't just annoying. It could attract predators or rival humans. So silence was survival. Rocking, shushing, binding babies tightly, every technique aimed not at comfort, but at concealment, and the discipline started early. In Arctic tribes, babies were trained to stay quiet in snow huts, where noise meant death. In Amazonian groups, children learned to obey through nonverbal cues. A raised eyebrow could stop them mid-step. Corporal punishment wasn't an invention of modern schools, it was a family tool. If you thought toddlers were chaotic now, imagine them near a fire pit or sacred shrine, and you'll understand why ancient mothers didn't mess around. Still, there was tenderness woven through. Songs whispered into tiny ears carried myths, taboos, and genealogies. Lullabies weren't just for soothing, they were cultural scripts. Through rhythm and rhyme, you taught babies who they were, where they belonged, what spirits watched them. Even while exhausted, you were shaping identity with every note. And when you passed a baby to your mother or grandmother, it wasn't just to catch a break. Older women carried knowledge about herbs, about illnesses, about what signs meant life and what signs meant death. Without them, survival odds plummeted. And don't forget, you were still working. Childcare wasn't separate from labor, it was fused to it. You strapped the baby to your back and went to the fields. You laid it in a sling while you ground grain. You hushed it while weaving baskets. Your productivity didn't pause because of motherhood. It just got heavier, noisier, riskier. If the child lived long enough to walk, you had another worker in training. Tiny hands fetching sticks, carrying water, imitating chores. But even then, you never stopped worrying. A single fever could undo years of care. Death lurked at every corner, and you had to keep loving children you might lose. Imagine the emotional calculus, bonding deeply, but always knowing tomorrow they might not be there. So child rearing wasn't sentimental, it was gritty, communal, relentless. And even as you poured everything into keeping children alive, the silence you lived under didn't lift. In fact, the older you got, the more silence was demanded of you, not just in parenting, but in public life, where your voice carried less than the sound of your grinding stone. By now, you've survived birth, pregnancy, and child rearing. You'd think that would earn you a voice, right? Wrong. In ancient tribes, women's words had weight only when whispered, rarely when spoken aloud. Silence wasn't just a suggestion, it was a survival strategy. If birth was blood and motherhood was labor, public life was silence. In many tribal societies, men dominated councils, rituals, and decisions. Anthropologists studying lineage systems have endless case notes, men debating warfare, trade, alliances, while women prepared food outside the circle. If you tried to raise your voice, at best, you'd be ignored. At worst, you'd be accused of meddling, arrogance, or worse. And no one wants to be the woman branded a witch in a society where justice sometimes meant a hole in the ground. But silence wasn't always passive. Women learned to use it like a tool. Quiet presence in domestic spaces gave you influence over children, over food distribution, over small but crucial resources. A mother could guide sons. A grandmother could whisper advice that shaped decisions indirectly. Matrilineal groups like the Iroquois showed just how sharp this power could be. There, women controlled property and had the final word on whether war parties were launched. But even then, it wasn't about loud speeches. It was about consensus, quiet veto, and the unspoken threat of withdrawing support. Still, in most societies, silence was enforced. You didn't interrupt men in ritual. You didn't argue in council. Your speech could be considered dangerous. Words carried weight, and women's words were seen as doubly risky, capable of curses, of disrupting male authority, of summoning chaos. Better to keep them short, guarded, and rare. Silence, after all, couldn't be used against you. But silence didn't erase fear. Domestic violence existed, evidenced in skeletal remains and ethnographic parallels. Women bore the marks, fractures, injuries that suggest disputes weren't always settled with words. In such worlds, silence wasn't submission. It was protection. Say nothing, survive longer. And yet silence didn't mean invisibility. Women's work shaped everything: food, children, ritual purity. Without your labor, the men's councils would starve. Without your rituals of menstruation, birth, and burial, the tribe's cosmology collapsed. You held cosmic strings in your hands, even if no one let you tug them in public. That's the paradox. You were central but silent, powerful but muted. The tension hummed in everyday life. Imagine grinding grain while men debated raids, thinking to yourself, without this bread, your army wouldn't last 2 days. You didn't say it. You didn't need to. Silence was your shield and your rebellion. But silence was heavy, and it didn't erase fear. Because while your labor was praised, your body was always vulnerable. Marriage alliances might protect you, but raids, abductions, and violence made women the most expendable currency in tribal conflict. Which brings us to the darker side of this life, the part where silence no longer protected you, because violence spoke louder than you ever could. Silence could keep you alive inside your own hearth, but it didn't shield you from the violence outside. It tore sometimes, right inside it. If you had been a woman in an ancient tribe, fear was stitched into daily life as tightly as your clothing. Not cinematic fear, not one big dramatic moment. It was the quiet, constant hum of danger in the background, like the hiss of a snake you couldn't quite see. Start with raids. For many tribal groups, conflict wasn't about annihilating enemies. It was about resources, status, or vengeance, and women were prime prizes. Raids often meant abductions, carrying women off as captives, wives, or slaves. Archaeological sites in Europe and the Americas show female skeletons far from their native regions, often buried without kin, suggesting forced relocation. You weren't just at risk of losing your home, you were the resource being stolen. Captivity wasn't always a death sentence. In some societies, women were integrated into the new group, married off, and absorbed into kinship lines. But integration is just a polite word for what it really was: coerced survival. Your silence wasn't choice anymore. It was imposed. Speak the wrong word, refuse the wrong man, and violence answered. And violence wasn't just external. Domestic violence left its marks too. Fractured ribs, skull trauma, healed forearm breaks. Archaeologists have noted patterns in female remains, suggesting interpersonal violence, not warfare. In plain terms, beatings, punishment, control. A husband's authority wasn't just cultural. It was enforced with fists or sticks. If you thought modern family drama was bad, imagine living in a world where a bruise wasn't scandalous but expected. Even ritual could mask violence. Some tribal initiation rites involved women being scarred, cut, or tattooed, their pain rebranded as tradition. Anthropologists working in Africa and Oceania documented practices like ritual beatings or enforced seclusion, presented as purification or preparation. Your blood was never really yours. It was drawn out of you, demanded by custom, whether you agreed or not. Fear lived in the body. You learned to walk carefully, laugh quietly, obey quickly. You learned which men to avoid at night, which paths were unsafe, which silences were necessary. In foraging groups, sexual coercion wasn't uncommon, and women formed protective bonds with other women's sisters, mothers, grandmothers, to buffer themselves. But solidarity had limits. In a world where survival meant alliances, betrayal was always possible, and fear didn't end with adulthood. Childbirth could kill you, but so could suspicion. A barren woman was vulnerable to rejection, abuse, or replacement. A woman accused of adultery, or even rumored could, face ostracism or execution. In tribal law, women's bodies were where social order was inscribed. Step out of line, and punishment was swift. The blood of violence mingled with the blood of menstruation and childbirth, each carrying its own dread. You weren't free to own your body. You managed it, endured it, defended it. Fear taught you silence, and silence taught you survival. But blood wasn't only tied to fear. It was also tied to ritual and cosmology, where your cycles were woven into the fabric of myth. So let's step from violence into ritual, where the same blood that made you a target also made you sacred or dangerous depending on who was watching. By now, blood has been trailing you like a bad omen. Birth blood, menstrual blood, the blood of beatings and violence. But in ancient tribes, blood wasn't just bodily fluid, it was cosmology. It was sacred, dangerous, a currency between the human and the divine. And as a woman, you carried it whether you wanted to or not. Take menstruation. Across the world, it was rarely treated casually. In some Native American groups, menstrual huts or lodges were built specifically for seclusion. You bled alone, apart from the village, because your blood could weaken hunters or anger spirits. Among the Dogon of Mali, menstruating women stayed in separate houses, visible reminders that blood was too powerful to ignore. Some anthropologists even argue these spaces were protective, giving women a break from labor. Protective, yes, but also isolating, stigmatizing, and loaded with suspicion. Then there was childbirth, blood. It too was marked as both sacred and polluting. In Pacific Island groups, women often gave birth in separate huts, with rituals designed to protect the newborn from spiritual contamination. In ancient South American societies, archaeologists have found charms and figurines buried near birth sites, intended to shield both mother and child. But protection was double-edged implied danger. Your blood could bring life, but it could also bring death if mishandled. Sacrifice carried its own crimson weight. In Mesoamerica, myths tied female blood to creation itself. In some Amazonian groups, ritual cutting marked initiation into womanhood. Among Australian Aboriginal groups, menstrual and childbirth, blood was central to women's business in ceremonies, knowledge restricted, sacred, never to be spoken in front of men. Silence wasn't just survival, it was ritual law. But here's the irony, the same men who feared your blood also depended on it. Fertility rituals often revolved around your cycles, with crops, rains, and cosmic balance linked to the mysterious workings of your body. If harvests failed, suspicion fell on women. Had they broken a taboo? Had blood not been managed correctly? Your body became both scapegoat and savior. And rituals didn't stop with your blood, they used your skin. Scarification and tattooing marked life stages, inscribing permanence with needles and blades. In some African societies, scars were carved into women's bodies as proof of endurance, beauty, or readiness for motherhood. Pain wasn't private. It was a ritual language everyone could read. Blood was your script, and your skin was the parchment. Even after death, blood clung to ritual imagination. Burial practices often emphasized female fertility figurines, beads, tools placed near the pelvis. You weren't remembered as an individual so much as a womb, a vessel of blood turned to dust. Archaeology keeps finding this pattern. Men buried with weapons, women buried with grindstones, beads, and symbols of reproduction. Blood defined you in life, and the echo of it defined you in death. So yes, blood made you holy, dangerous, indispensable. But holiness didn't equal freedom, it meant scrutiny. You couldn't sneeze without someone wondering if it was connected to your cycle, your womb, your blood. Your body was ritual space, and you didn't get to close the temple doors. And while ritual might have wrapped your blood in myth, healing wrapped it in herbs. Because when blood became too much, when it wouldn't stop flowing, when it weakened, when it risked killing you, turned to midwives, healers, women who knew how to wrestle with it. If blood was constant, then someone had to manage it. And that someone, more often than not, was another woman. In ancient tribes, healing wasn't a white-robed doctor with scalpels, whilst your aunt crouched beside a smoky fire, grinding leaves into paste, whispering to spirits, and trying to stop you from bleeding out. Midwives and healers weren't extras in this story. They were the only line between you and death. Midwifery was universal. From Ice Age caves to Amazonian clearings, someone had the knowledge of how to turn babies in the womb, how to massage a pelvis, how to cut cords with stone or bone tools. Archaeological digs sometimes find bundles of herbs, charms or figurines buried with women, suggesting their role as birth attendants. They weren't medical professionals, but their skills were the closest thing to medicine you were ever going to get. Herbal knowledge was encyclopedic, passed from one woman to the next. Willow bark for pain, honey for infection, garlic for wounds. Across the world, women knew which plants soothed cramps, which sped up labor, which acted as abortifacients when pregnancy threatened survival. Yes, abortions existed, long before clinics and debates. Roots, teas, and poultices were used discreetly, because sometimes survival meant ending what had barely begun. But herbs weren't enough. Ritual stepped in where medicine failed. In many tribal societies, illness was never just physical. Spirits, ancestors, broken tabazol could make you sick. Healing often involved chants, smoke, sacred objects. A healer might wave burning herbs over your body, call on ancestors, or mark you with protective ash. Was it science? No. But was it effective? Sometimes. Yes, placebo and prayer carry their own power, especially in a world where belief shaped reality. And midwives weren't just about birth. They were the managers of female pain, menstruation, miscarriages, postpartum hemorrhage, menopause. They carried remedies for milk supply, for fevers, for the endless ailments that stalked women's bodies. Anthropologists studying ethnobotany note that women's plant knowledge often exceeded men's precisely because their survival depended on it. The men might know which bark poisoned an arrow. The women knew which root stopped a hemorrhage. Guess which knowledge saved more lives on a daily basis. But there was danger in this power. Too much healing skill, too many successful births, and you were revered. A slip in fortune, a woman dying despite your efforts, and suddenly you were whispered about. Healers could become witches with alarming speed. Silence returned here. Too, you kept your knowledge close, your rituals discreet, because if misfortune struck, people looked for someone to blame, and the midwife's hands were the most visible. Still, without them, survival would have plummeted. Every tribal group had its healers, its midwives, its women who carried knowledge like fire passed hand to hand, never written, always remembered. They weren't thanked in stone carvings or epic songs, but their fingerprints are everywhere, in the children who lived, in the mothers who survived, in the herbs that still grow where their hands once dug. And when age crept in, the role of healer often shifted seamlessly into that of elder. The older you got, the less you bled, the less you birthed, the more you advised. Which means, oddly enough, the silence that once smothered you could transform into authority if you lived long enough to earn it. If you made it to old age, first of all, congratulations. That alone was a statistical miracle. Surviving childbirth after childbirth, labor after labor, raids, famines, infections, it meant you'd outlasted a roulette wheel rigged against you. And once the bleeding stopped, menopause, that final curtain on fertility, you entered a strange double-edged stage of life. On one hand, you were no longer chained to the dangers of pregnancy. On the other, you were free to become something else entirely, a source of authority, or a target of suspicion, sometimes both at once. Anthropologists call this the grandmother effect. In many foraging groups, grandmothers weren't just cuddly storytellers, they were survival engines. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, older women provided a steady stream of food when younger mothers were burdened with infants. Without them, children's chances of survival dropped. Evolution itself seems to have favored grandmothers. Your longevity was less about personal glory and more about babysitting efficiently enough to keep your bloodline going. Authority crept in with age. Freed from menstruation and childbirth, older women were often seen as wise, their knowledge of herbs, taboos, and stories unmatched. Among the Iroquois, clan mothers held veto power in councils warriors might posture, but older women could quietly say no and shut down an entire campaign. In Bantu groups, elder women controlled land rights through matrilineal inheritance. Your silence, once enforced, became selective. You could finally choose when to speak, and people listened, but it wasn't always benevolent authority. The same mystique that made elders respected also made them feared. Postmenopausal women, no longer defined by fertility, could be rebranded as witches. In sub-Saharan Africa, accusations of witchcraft often targeted older women widows, solitary figures, those who spoke too freely. The irony was cruel. The same knowledge that kept people alive could, under stress or misfortune, be twisted into evidence that you'd cause death instead. Reverence and fear danced side by side, and aging wasn't exactly restful. Your body bore the map of a lifetime's work. Archaeologists examining female skeletons from ancient tribes find arthritis, compressed spines, worn teeth, heel fractures. Old age meant living in constant pain, without medicine, while still contributing. You didn't retire to a rocking chair, you kept grinding, weaving, advising, until your body forced you to stop. Yet for all the hardship, there was a strange freedom. No more menstrual huts, no more birth huts, no more risks of dying in labor. You were outside the cycles that once controlled you, and that made you powerful in ways young women couldn't be. You carried the stories, the genealogies, the unspoken rules. You were memory incarnate. And memory, in tribal societies, was wealth. So old age was paradoxical. You could be revered, you could be feared, you could be quietly sidelined, but you were never irrelevant. Your silence, once imposed by survival, could become the silence of authority, the kind people leaned into, waiting for the word you might or might not speak. And when death finally approached, even your burial would be shaped by your womanhood, because the tools and symbols laid beside you told the same story they always had. You weren't remembered for being you. You were remembered for being what you worked, what you bled, and what you birthed. If you survived long enough to finally lie down and not get back up, death wasn't exactly the peace you'd expect. In ancient tribes, how you were buried said less about who you were and more about what you'd done for the group, or rather, what your body had been used for. Men went into the ground with weapons, proof of bravery and blood spilled. Women went into the ground with beads, pots, grinding stones, and the tools that had carved grooves into their bones. Archaeology calls them grave goods. You might call them your resume. Look at Neolithic burials across Europe. Women often buried with sickles, loom weights, or bone needles, reminders of the hours spent weaving and feeding. In the Near East, graves of women sometimes include shells or figurines tied to fertility, because even in death, your womb was still your headline. Anthropologists dig into soil and pull up the same story over and over. Men remembered as fighters, women remembered as workers and mothers. The afterlife wasn't going to let you forget it. Of course, some women broke the mold. Elite burials show female priestesses, women interred with ritual objects, jewelry, or symbols of spiritual power. Think of the Minoan snake priestess figurines, or richly adorned burials in ancient Mesopotamia. These were rare exceptions, reminders that not every woman's legacy was domestic grind. But exceptions didn't erase the rule, they only made the rule more obvious, and the body itself told tales. Osteological studies show women's skeletons carrying the scars of their labor right into the grave. Arthritic knees from grinding grain, compressed spines from hauling water, dental enamel worn from holding fibers while weaving. Death didn't erase the evidence, it preserved it. Your bones became your autobiography, and archaeologists thousands of years later are still reading every painful line. Burial rituals reflected the same ambivalence society had shown you in life. Sacred but constrained, central but muted. Among some indigenous North American groups, women were buried with children at their sides, emphasizing the maternal role into eternity. In Andean societies, women's bodies were wrapped in layers of cloth and placed with offerings of food, ensuring they continued to serve even in the afterlife. But not all deaths were treated equally. Infanticide, stillbirths, or women who died in childbirth often left fewer archaeological traces. Hurried burials, shallow graves, sometimes none at all. Your memory could be as provisional as your life had been. And if your death came during war or raid, captured women weren't always buried with ceremony at all. Death, like life, wasn't fair. And yet, for all its harshness, burial had meaning. People mourned, sang, whispered prayers. They sent you off with charms against spirits, food for the journey, beads to please the ancestors. They may not have written your name, but they marked your passage. And in that marking, they admitted something they never said aloud. Women were the backbone. Your silence in life became eternal silence in the earth, but it was layered with objects that told everyone who found you later exactly how much you'd carried. So yes, you rested at last, but even in death you were catalogued, weighed, defined by labor and fertility and legacy. That was the cruelest twist. Because while men's deeds were carved in story and stone, women's voices faded into soil, erased, forgotten, unnamed until archaeologists brushed dust from your bones and pieced together, too late, the story you'd never been allowed to tell. So you've been born, bled, worked, birthed, survived, buried. Now you'd think the story ends. But in ancient tribes, your greatest risk wasn't death, it was being forgotten. Legacy wasn't guaranteed for women. In fact, it was often erased before it began. Written records, almost none. When early writing appeared in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valleyate was men scratching down taxes, wars, and dynasties. Women's names appear only as queens, priestesses, or prostitutes. Everyone else, silence. Your life was measured in calories produced, children raised, skins tanned, pots made, none of which got carved into stone. History didn't notice your work because it was too busy eating the food you'd cooked. Archaeology tries to fill the gap, but even there, women are often reconstructed through objects rather than voices. A loom weight here, a grinding stone there, beads scattered near the pelvis. Your legacy is catalogued as domestic, reproductive, supportive. Men left weapons and wounds. You left arthritis and beads. It's not that you didn't shape the world. It's that your impact was invisible by design. And then there's myth. When women did make it into cultural memory, they were transformed into symbols rather than people. Fertility goddesses, earth mothers, temptresses, witches. Your body became allegory, stripped of individuality. A woman wasn't remembered as herself, she was remembered as a category. Maiden, mother, crone. You weren't a name, you were a role. Erasure could even be deliberate. In patrilineal systems, lineage traced through men, which meant women's names were unnecessary in genealogies. Your children were remembered as sons of X, never sons of you. Your labor was absorbed, your body forgotten. Your story folded into someone else's. It's one of history's nastiest tricks. Women kept societies alive, but society never bothered to write their names down. And yet, traces slip through. In graves of the Cucatina Trapelia culture in Eastern Europe, figurines of women abound, suggesting female symbolism saturated ritual life. In some African oral traditions, powerful matriarchs live on as ancestors who guided clans. Among the Iroquois, clan mothers' decisions shaped entire nations. Legacy existed, but it lived in whispers, symbols, fragments, nothing like the thunderous monuments men built to themselves. The cruel irony, sometimes erasure wasn't even permanent. Thousands of years later, archaeologists dig up your bones, measure your arthritis, write papers about your pelvis. Modern scholars try to reconstruct your daily grind with phrases like female agency and subsistence contribution. You've become data. Your life once silence and blood transformed into footnotes and conference slides. Is that legacy, or just another kind of forgetting? And here's the kicker. Your erasure wasn't accidental. It was systemic. Women's roles were so essential they became invisible. Like fire, like water. You don't write odes to what sustains you every day. You only write songs about the hunt, the war, the feast. Which means your legacy was there, burning quietly in every survival, but never celebrated. So yes, if you'd been a woman in an ancient tribe, your life would have been silence, fear, blood and erasure. Your story wouldn't be told. Not until much later, by strangers dusting bones in museums. And even then, they'd mispronounced your name, if they found it at all. In tribal societies, a girl's life rarely unfolded in soft gradients, it snapped instead. One day she was a child, gathering firewood, trailing behind older sisters, still close enough to the hearth to be considered harmless. And then, with the sudden arrival of blood, everything changed. Childhood was not a slow fade-out but a door slammed shut. The onset of puberty was less a private milestone than a public announcement. Blood was proof of fertility, and fertility was everyone's business. In societies across Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, menarche was the unmistakable signal that a girl's body had entered the economy of marriage. From that moment, her life was redirected not toward selfhood, but toward preparation. Her daily tasks shifted. Chores that had once been casual apprenticeships, helping grind grain, fetching water, weaving small baskets hardened into expectation. Play, if it had existed at all, disappeared. From puberty onward, her worth was measured in endurance, obedience, and the ability to carry the burdens of womanhood without complaint. And there were eyes everywhere. Brothers, fathers, uncles, elders all saw the body differently now. Even peers, other girls her age, became both allies and rivals in the same system. A young girl's first menstruation was a source of both pride and anxiety for her family. Pride, because it meant she could now be married, exchanged, invested into alliances. Anxiety, because it also meant her sexuality had to be controlled. A womb was a valuable commodity, but only if unspoiled. Anthropologists have long noted how societies turned this biological shift into a cultural one, through ritual. In some, girls were immediately withdrawn from daily life, kept indoors or secluded, their bodies marked as liminal between child and woman, between safety and danger. Seclusion wasn't leisure, it was surveillance. Everything was watched: what they ate, where they sat, who they spoke to. Silence became an initiation, teaching that their voices no longer belonged to them. But even without formal ritual, the transition left traces in the body. Skeletal remains from agrarian tribes show the early toll of this shift. Pelvic stress from adolescent pregnancies, enamel wear from nutritional deficits during growth. Puberty wasn't just about breasts and blood, it was about a body conscripted into service earlier than it could bear. And yet, the transformation was celebrated, even adorned. In some groups, girls at puberty were decorated with beads, painted with ochre, marked with designs that announced their new status. The paradox of tribal puberty lay here. It was both confinement and display, isolation and exposure. A girl became hidden from some eyes and showcased to others, a strange performance of purity and availability staged all at once. It was a narrow bridge to walk, and dangerous to crossing into womanhood meant stepping directly into the shadow of marriage, where the rituals of pain began in earnest. And the first step after puberty was often the most claustrophobic of all, being removed from ordinary life and placed into the seclusion of initiation huts, where the lessons of obedience, silence, and suffering were carved deeper than any beadwork could show. The hut stood at the edge of the settlement, small, dark, and deliberately apart. It was here that a girl was sent when her childhood ended, her body claimed by new rules. Across continents, the custom repeats itself: Africa, Oceania, the Americas. Pubescent girls, withdrawn from daily life and placed into seclusion. It was not punishment, though it carried its sting. It was initiation, a suspension from ordinary existence so that she could be remade into something fit for marriage. Inside, life was stripped down. Food was controlled, sometimes reduced, sometimes restricted to bland staples that symbolized purity. Conversation was minimal. In many cultures, girls were told to remain silent, to speak little or not at all. The lesson was clear: silence was discipline, and discipline was the foundation of obedience. The seclusion hut also had its instructors. Older women, often aunts or ritual specialists, entered to teach. The education wasn't arithmetic or astronomy. It was domestic law: how to cook for a husband, how to serve in-laws, how to endure labor pains, how to behave when struck, how to carry yourself in public so that no shame fell on the family. Instruction was practical, yes, but it was also ritualized. Lessons were often accompanied by taboos, symbolic gestures, or even mild punishments to ensure they stayed etched in memory. Among the Ndembu of Central Africa, anthropologists recorded initiation huts where girls were painted with white clay symbols of liminality, neither child nor woman. Among the Ojibwe, menstrual lodges marked a girl's separation, a recognition of her new spiritual danger and potency. Across societies, seclusion transformed the girl into a threshold figure, dangerous to normal order until she had been reshaped. Time inside varied. In some tribes it was only days, in others, weeks or months. For certain Amazonian groups, seclusion could last years, the girl re-emerging with tattooed skin and a body hardened by discipline. In all cases, seclusion was the controlled burning of childhood, a slow ritual that taught endurance through monotony and restriction. But huts were not just classrooms, they were theaters of surveillance. Every move was observed, every lapse noted. Girls who resisted, who spoke too loudly or disobeyed instructions, risked being marked as rebellious. Rebellion wasn't a youthful phase, it was a flaw that could taint marriage prospects. The hut trained not only behavior but reputation, and sometimes the seclusion itself was painful. Heat, hunger, exhaustion all part of the lesson. In Papua New Guinea, initiation seclusion involved food prohibitions so severe that bodies weakened, emphasizing submission. In other groups, the confinement was paired with ritual beatings or scarification, the body literally inscribed with lessons of obedience. When the seclusion ended, the girl stepped out not as herself, but as something molded, painted, scarred, decorated. She was displayed to the community as transformed. The pain of separation, the silence of confinement, the marks of endurance all signaled readiness. She was now visible, but not as an individual. She was a vessel for marriage, for alliances, for lineage, and the moment of emergence only led deeper. Because if the hut taught silence, the next stage taught that even the body itself was not immune from control. The rituals that followed reached skin and flesh directly: scarification, tattooing, cuts that left no doubt that marriage readiness was written not just in lessons but in blood. When the blood first appeared, it was rarely treated as ordinary. Menstrual blood was too volatile, too powerful, too dangerous, or too sacred, depending on who was speaking. In tribal societies across the world, it marked the moment when a girl's body stopped belonging to herself and started belonging to cosmology. Every drop was a sign, a risk, a potential curse. Among the Dogon of Mali, menstrual huts were built on the outskirts of the village. Women withdrew there each month, sleeping apart, cooking apart, even speaking apart. The red line wasn't just physical, it was social, dividing those who bled from those who didn't, those who were pure from those temporarily marked. The blood wasn't ignored, it was ritualized into architecture. In native North America, menstrual lodges carried the same double edge. Girls were removed, not to be hidden in shame, but to protect the community from their power. Hunters believed contact with menstrual blood weakened arrows and spoiled game. Warriors feared it could sap their strength. The irony, of course, was that the very fluid that symbolized fertility was treated like poison. Too much life in one place apparently looked like danger in another. The prohibitions varied. In some groups, menstruating girls couldn't touch food. In others, they couldn't step over tools or walk near sacred fires. Silence often accompanied these rules. Speaking too freely was thought to spread contamination. So girls learned quickly that menstruation meant withdrawal, not just from work, but from words. And the taboos followed into marriage preparation. A girl's bleeding body wasn't just a biological fact, it was a ritual marker. Elders taught her how to handle it, what herbs to use, how to dispose of cloths or moss pads, how to wash without offending spirits. Menstrual management wasn't about comfort. It was about maintaining cosmic balance, making sure the blood didn't step out of place. Yet, even with all the restrictions, blood carried reverence. In parts of Melanesia, menstrual blood was tied to ideas of regeneration. In some Amazonian myths, it was the original paint, the first pigment used to mark bodies. It terrified men, yes, but it also reminded them that life itself flowed from a cycle they could never control. Fear and awe braided together in every prohibition, and the girl caught in it learned the lesson. Her body was not private. Its functions were visible to the group, marked in rules, seclusion, and whispers. Every cycle was another rehearsal for the scrutiny she'd endure in marriage. Pain wasn't absent here either. Cramps, bleeding, exhaustion, endured without relief, since comfort wasn't a concept written into ritual law. Herbs helped, but suffering was part of the expectation. If childbirth demanded endurance, menstruation was its monthly training drill. The taboos shaped how girls thought of themselves. A body that bled was never neutral, it was risky, mystical, potentially shameful. And by treating blood as pollution, societies ensured girls entered marriage already accustomed to the idea that their bodies needed regulation. Control was external, not internal. The restrictions didn't last forever, of course. Once the first cycles had passed and the girl had endured seclusion and silence, her body was declared ready to move into the next stage. The preparations for marriage grew sharper, more visible, and much more painful, etched into the skin itself, through scars and tattoos that announced to the world that she had been remade. The body was never allowed to remain untouched. Childhood ended, blood appeared, seclusion taught silence, and then came the knife, or the thorn, or the needle. Across continents, skin became the canvas where marriage readiness was written. Scarification and tattooing weren't optional fashion statements. They were requirements, public proof that a girl had endured the pain necessary to be transformed into a wife. In much of sub-Saharan Africa, raised scars lined torsos, arms, and faces. Patterns, varied lines across the abdomen, dots on the chest, swirls along the thighs, but the logic was consistent. Each mark carried meaning. Some scars signaled clan identity, others fertility, others beauty. The stomach was often targeted, a literal advertisement of the womb beneath. A scarred belly was a marriage certificate carved in flesh. The process was brutal. Cuts made with sharp stones, shells, or knives. Ash or dye rubbed into the wounds to raise or darken them. Days of swelling, infection, and fever as the body fought to heal. Pain wasn't hidden, it was the point. Endurance proved strength, and strength was what a husband's household demanded. A girl who could sit through hours of cutting without flinching was one who could be trusted to endure childbirth, domestic labor, and the long grind of marriage. Tattooing carried the same message in different ink. In Polynesia, young women bore tattoos around the thighs and hips, regions explicitly tied to sexuality and fertility. Among the Inuit, tattooed lines on the face and arms marked transition into womanhood. The inked skin telling the community that marriage readiness had been achieved. Even in the Amazon, designs inked or cut into the flesh served as visible signals that a girl had crossed the painful threshold between child and wife. Beauty was the official story, but pain was the hidden curriculum. Girls learned that suffering wasn't to be avoided but embraced, worn permanently on the body. Marriage wasn't about ease. It was about submission to structures bigger than yourself. Every scar, every line of ink reminded you of that bargain. And of course, infection lurked behind the ritual. Healed scars are what survive on skeletons, but the process killed some girls. Cuts grew septic, fevers rose, and the very marks meant to prepare for marriage sometimes ensured there would be none. But anthropological logic is rarely merciful. Those who survived became the living proof of resilience. Their bodies admired precisely because they had nearly broken. It was never private. Scarification and tattooing were often done in groups, entire cohorts of girls marked together, the collective endurance reinforcing social cohesion. If one screamed too loudly, others mocked or pressured her to continue. Suffering wasn't only individual, it was communal theater, watched by elders who judged who had truly earned the right to marry. And once the wounds closed, the body glistened with its new decorations. The girl emerged, marked, transformed, her flesh no longer her own but a ledger of symbols others could read. She wasn't just a person anymore. She was a walking marriage contract, etched in skin and sanctified in pain. But scars and ink weren't the only ways bodies were prepared. In other places, the flesh wasn't cut, it was reshaped, stuffed, or starved into forms that matched cultural ideals. The marriage body wasn't always natural. Sometimes it was forced into existence through practices as cruel as they were celebrated. There are rituals where the skin is painted, pierced, or scarred, and then there are those where the knife goes deeper. In parts of Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, preparation for marriage sometimes meant not just marking the body, but altering it permanently. What anthropologists now call female genital cutting was, in those contexts, framed as purification, control, and above all, readiness for marriage. The procedures varied. In some regions, the clitoris was cut away. In others, labia were removed. In the most extreme, the vulva was sewn closed, leaving only a small opening for urine and menstrual blood. Infibulation, as that last practice is known, turned the body itself into a locked chamber. The logic was blunt. A girl who had been closed was proof of virginity, proof of chastity, proof that her sexuality was under control. The act was rarely private. Older women, midwives, or ritual specialists carried out the procedure, sometimes with a razor, sometimes with a shard of glass, sometimes with a knife passed from hand to hand. Girls were held down, often by their own relatives, while the cutting was done. Screaming wasn't just expected, it was part of the ordeal. Endurance was valorized, but pain was unavoidable. And yet, within the culture, it wasn't described as cruelty. It was called tradition, discipline, even beauty. In Somali communities, infibulated girls were praised as clean and smooth, ready to be wives. Among some Nubian groups, songs were sung during the cutting, dressing the wound in poetry. Pain was rebranded as virtue, blood as proof of transformation. The risks, though, were immense. Hemorrhage, infection, tetanus death was not uncommon. Those who survived often carried lifelong consequences: obstructed labor, chronic pain, complications in childbirth. Archaeological evidence is harder to trace here, but ethnographic accounts are clear. Marriage preparation through genital cutting was as much about controlling reproduction as it was about marking endurance. The meaning was always tied to marriage. An uncut girl could be mocked, excluded, or deemed unmarriageable. Families sometimes insisted on the ritual precisely because a daughter's future and the family's reputation depended on it. A groom's family might demand proof that the bride had undergone the procedure. In infibulation, the new husband would literally cut open the stitched flesh on the wedding night, turning consummation into a second act of violence. Not every society practiced it. Even within Africa, traditions varied widely. Some cultures had no genital cutting at all, but where it existed, it was inseparable from ideas of control. Female sexuality was seen as unruly, dangerous, needing restraint. Marriage preparation thus meant carving obedience into the flesh itself. And here again, the lesson echoed those earlier scars and tattoos. Pain was education. Suffering wasn't incidental, it was the curriculum. A girl who had endured the knife was said to be purified, disciplined, fit for marriage. But cutting wasn't the only way the body was altered. In other places, the marriage-ready girl wasn't cut but reshaped, fattened, or bound into an ideal that had less to do with health and more to do with what a husband's eyes expected. The preparation of girls for marriage didn't always draw blood, but it rarely spared the body. Not every marriage ritual reached for the knife. In some places, the body wasn't cut, it was molded. Girls were prepared for marriage by being force-fed, bound, or reshaped into the cultural ideal of beauty and fertility. If scarification wrote endurance on the skin, body shaping sculpted it directly. In West Africa, particularly in Mauritania and Niger, the practice of gavage, force-feeding girls, was seen as essential preparation for marriage. Thinness signaled poverty, neglect, or infertility. Fatness, by contrast, displayed wealth, prosperity, and readiness to bear children. Girls as young as 6 were fed milk, couscous, or millet porridge in quantities designed to stretch stomachs and widen hips. Refusal wasn't an option. Sticks or threats often enforced compliance, and vomiting was met with punishment. The ideal was a body softened by excess, a body that announced to the village that she was worth a high bride wealth. The paradox was sharp. In societies where food was scarce, forcing a girl to consume it beyond her will was a public demonstration of abundance. Her flesh became a display of family prestige. The suffering stomach pain, illness, sometimes lifelong metabolic problems, was invisible behind the curve of hips admired by potential husbands. Elsewhere, shaping took different forms. In pre-colonial Indonesia, beetle chewing stained teeth black, a mark of maturity and beauty. In some East African groups, teeth were deliberately removed, painful, bloody alterations framed as aesthetics or preparation for adult roles. Among the Apennine of Brazil, lips and ears were pierced and stretched, a slow reshaping of flesh that left permanent markers of endurance. And then there was binding. In China, from the Song dynasty onward, foot binding twisted the body into an excruciating performance of femininity. Young girls' feet were broken, wrapped tightly, reshaped into the lotus foot, prized as delicate, erotic, and proof of submission. Marriage prospects depended on it. Though different in context from African force-feeding, the logic was the same. A girl's suffering was her dowry, her body reconfigured into a credential for marriage. In all cases, the preparation was communal. Mothers, grandmothers, and older women enforced the rituals. They weren't seen as cruelty, but as tradition, the painful maintenance of cultural ideals. Love meant inflicting suffering for the sake of future acceptance, and the girl learned, long before marriage, that her body wasn't hers, was clay, molded by others into the shape deemed desirable. The body itself bore witness. Anthropologists examining bones from agricultural societies find compressed spines and arthritic joints, not from accidents, but from years of burdens layered on growing frames. Flesh and bone carried memory long after the rituals ended. Yet the reasoning was consistent. Pain equaled discipline, endurance equaled worth. A marriageable girl was one who had suffered, visibly, tangibly, publicly. Her reshaped body was a social contract written in flesh, and this was just the exterior. The rituals of fattening, binding, and reshaping trained the body. But the next stage trained the will. Because marriage wasn't just about how a woman looked. It was about whether she could obey, and obedience was taught through pain as well. Carved into initiation rituals, where endurance itself became the final test. Pain was never incidental. It was curriculum. To prepare a girl for marriage meant teaching her to endure suffering with silence, because silence in pain was read as strength. Marriage itself promised no shortage of hardship: childbirth, domestic labor, subordination, so initiation rituals simply rehearsed the agony in advance. In East Africa, tooth extraction was common. Front teeth were pulled, not for medical reasons, but as proof of endurance and as a marker of adulthood. The bleeding gums, the swelling face, the raw wound, these were initiation trophies. Archaeologists still find skulls missing teeth in neat, deliberate patterns, their absence a cultural signature. Elsewhere, beatings were part of the process. Among some groups in Oceania, girls undergoing initiation were struck with sticks, their bodies marked with bruises that healed into lessons. The strikes weren't about punishment, they were symbolic, training the girl to withstand obedience and discipline in marriage. Pain was a script, repeated across bodies, generations, and landscapes. Scarification rituals doubled as tests of silence. If a girl cried out too loudly, if she begged for the cutting to stop, whispers would follow her for life. A woman who flinched under ritual pain was seen as one who might falter in childbirth or disobey a husband. The body had to prove, publicly, that it could be ruled. Even seclusion sometimes came with pain. Food restrictions, forced fasts, sleep deprivation all served to weaken the body, then celebrate its survival. In Papua New Guinea, initiation huts often combined seclusion with painful ordeals, leaving girls physically exhausted and symbolically purified. The endurance was theatrical. Families, elders, sometimes even the whole community watched. Pain wasn't private. It was a public performance of worthiness. Just as warriors proved themselves in battle, girls proved themselves in ritual wounds. The applause wasn't literal, but the acknowledgement was there. She had suffered, and in suffering, she had become marriageable. And this wasn't unique to one region. From scarification in West Africa to tattooing in Polynesia, from tooth pulling in Sudan to beatings in the Pacific. The message repeated: pain is preparation. A girl's body was shaped not just by hands and knives, but by how well she endured agony. It worked like a contract. The community inflicted pain, and the girl bore it without protest. In that silence, she signed her body over to the expectations of marriage. Anthropologists often note that these rituals didn't just prepare women for their roles, they normalized suffering as an inevitable part of womanhood. The lesson was clear: pain wasn't an accident of life, it was life. And once the endurance was proven, the education turned more explicit. After scars and bruises came words, lessons about how to behave in marriage, how to submit, how to serve. Because preparing a girl for marriage wasn't just about showing she could suffer. It was about teaching her why she would need to keep suffering once the rituals ended. Once the bruises faded and the cuts scabbed, the lessons began. Endurance was only half the preparation. Obedience was the other. Marriage wasn't about the girl's desires, it was about her function. And so, in the shadow of ritual pain, older women gathered to teach her the curriculum of silence, submission, and service. Instruction came wrapped in authority. Mothers, aunts, ritual specialists, they became both teachers and enforcers. Their words carried the weight of survival. They didn't speak of romance or choice. They spoke of duties: how to cook for a husband, how to wash his clothes, how to manage in-laws, how to accept discipline without protest. Domestic labor wasn't just work, it was moral order, and failure could invite shame or even violence. Sex was included, though rarely as pleasure. Lessons were often stark and pragmatic. Among the Gikuyu of Kenya, ethnographies recorded that girls in initiation were explicitly instructed in sexual expectations, obedience in bed, silence during intercourse, the importance of fertility. In other cultures, older women demonstrated techniques through songs, metaphors, or even direct instruction, all framed as the obligations of marriage rather than intimacy. Fertility hovered above every word. A wife wasn't valuable because she was witty or charming. She was valuable because she could bear children, preferably sons. Girls were taught taboos to protect fertility, which foods to avoid, which rituals to observe, which silences to keep. Instruction in sexuality wasn't just about the act itself. It was about safeguarding reproduction, the family's continuity, the lineage's survival. And this training wasn't always gentle. If a girl resisted, if she questioned, if she showed reluctance, punishment could follow. Some initiation schools in parts of West Africa combined instruction with physical discipline. Strikes, fasting, even ritual humiliation ensured the lessons stuck. The message was simple. Obedience wasn't optional. It was survival. Yet instruction wasn't purely oppressive. Older women used these moments to pass down knowledge that men didn't share. How to manage menstruation, how to avoid unwanted pregnancies with herbs, how to endure childbirth, how to protect children from illness. Embedded in lessons of obedience were also quiet fragments of female agency, strategies of endurance that circulated in whispers rather than proclamations. Still, the overall script was clear. Marriage meant submission, and the girl learned that her worth wasn't measured in words or independence, but in how seamlessly she folded into the machinery of household life. Domestic service and sexual compliance were not private matters. They were the foundation of the family's reputation. A disobedient wife wasn't just a problem for her husband, she was a problem for her entire kin group. By the end of instruction, the girl had absorbed a lifetime's worth of rules before she had even entered her husband's home. She knew when to stay silent, how to serve, what to endure, and how to hide pain. She had been reshaped, not only in flesh, but in will, and the rituals didn't end with words. Instruction was always followed by display, the public moment when the girl's transformation was unveiled. If pain was rehearsal and teaching was the script, then the final act was performance burying her body, her scars, her obedience before the community as proof that she was ready to be given away. After the pain, after the silence, after the endless drilling in obedience, there came the parade. A girl who had been hidden away in huts, cut and scarred, force-fed or reshaped, was suddenly brought into the open. Public display was the final stage, proof that the transformation was complete, and that the community had successfully manufactured another wife. The ceremonies varied, but the pattern echoed across cultures. In West African societies, newly initiated girls were led from seclusion to the village square, decorated with beads, cowrie shells, and paint. Their skin bore the raised scars of endurance, their hips padded with the fat of forced feeding, their hair styled in elaborate designs that signaled fertility. The crowd wasn't looking at individuals. It was inspecting vessels, potential wives, and future mothers. Music often accompanied the unveiling, drums, songs, dances, but the atmosphere wasn't frivolous. The spectacle was structured, symbolic. Every step, every ornament, every movement of the body reinforced that the girl had crossed the threshold. She was no longer a child. She was property in waiting. Marriage readiness ceremonies were, at heart, public endorsements. By parading a girl, the community announced that she was now eligible. In some regions of Papua New Guinea, girls who had endured seclusion and painful body modification were marched through dances, their bodies oiled and decorated, their endurance displayed as a kind of living advertisement. Families watched, negotiations began, alliances were whispered into place. The irony, of course, was that while the ceremonies seemed to celebrate the girl, they really celebrated the system. Her suffering, her scars, her silence, these were not hers alone. They were proof of her family's honor, her lineage's discipline, her clan's ability to produce a wife who had been properly shaped. Marriage wasn't about two people. It was about alliances sealed in bodies and blood. And sometimes the display went further, bordering on humiliation. In certain initiation schools in West Africa, girls were forced to dance or sing in public, showing submission before elders. Failure to comply brought ridicule, sometimes even ritual punishment in front of the crowd. The lesson was unmistakable. A wife's duty was not to resist, but to perform, even under watchful eyes. Adornment itself told the story. Beads symbolized fertility, shells symbolized wealth, painted designs announced maturity. The body became a canvas of readiness. In some cultures, nakedness or semi-nakedness was part of the ceremony, stripping away any lingering traces of childhood modesty. Exposure was itself a ritual. What had been hidden was now unveiled, offered for judgment. Anthropologists note that these ceremonies functioned as both theater and marketplace. A girl's readiness wasn't proclaimed in private, it was shouted across the community through ritual, song, and spectacle. The public display was a contract, ensuring that no one could later claim ignorance of her eligibility. She had been paraded, she had been seen, the transaction could proceed. And yet, behind the drums and beads, the girl carried silence. She was not the author of the performance, she was its stage. What looked like celebration was, in fact, the final seal on her preparation. The girl had been molded, instructed, scarred, and now displayed. She was ready not in her own words, but in theirs. From here, the rituals of marriage didn't just end with celebration. They folded into control, because once the girl was officially prepared, the painful lessons of obedience became permanent. The body was no longer only shaped for marriage, it was kept under watch for life. Every cut, every scar, every forced meal and whispered lesson wasn't just about preparing a girl for marriage. It was about control. Rituals didn't simply transform children into wives, they stitched social order into the skin. Pain wasn't random, it was regulation. In anthropological terms, these practices created what might be called docile bodies. In plain words, the more a girl endured, the more she learned that endurance was her role. Ritual pain taught submission. Seclusion taught silence. Public display taught performance. By the time marriage came, resistance had already been rehearsed out of her. The system worked because it was visible. A scarred body was a disciplined body. A fattened body was a controlled body. A tattooed body was a remembered body. Nothing about a woman's form was left untouched by ritual. Her appearance broadcast her compliance long before her husband's authority began, and the surveillance didn't end with initiation. Once married, the lessons stuck. A woman who had endured tooth extraction or genital cutting knew her body was bound by the same rules that had governed the ritual. A woman who had been force-fed as a girl learned that her flesh was never her own. Even the songs sung in initiation ceremonies resurfaced in marriage, repeated by mothers and aunts to remind wives of their duties. The cruelty of it was its efficiency. Rituals were communal, which meant the entire society enforced them. Mothers passed down the knife. Grandmothers enforced the seclusion. Aunts gave the lessons. Pain wasn't inflicted by enemies, but by kin. That blurred the line between care and control until obedience felt like tradition and suffering felt like heritage. Of course, not all societies were equally harsh. Some initiation rituals leaned more toward instruction than mutilation, more toward symbolic taboos than bodily harm. But even in gentler forms, the logic was the same. Girls were prepared not for independence, but for marriage. Marriage wasn't about love, it was about alliances, property, and reproduction. The rituals ensured no girl entered it without first learning her place. The anthropologist sees it clearly. Ritual as social glue. The girl's blood bound her to her family. Her scars bound her to her people. Her silence bound her to her husband. Every act of suffering served the same purpose, to remind her that her body was never hers alone. And yet, despite the weight of control, fragments of agency remained. In the spaces between rituals, women preserved herbal knowledge, whispered survival strategies, and taught daughters not just obedience but endurance. If rituals disciplined the body, women's quiet networks preserved the means to live within those constraints. Pain made them silent, but silence could also make them powerful. Still, the rituals did their work. They prepared girls for marriage with suffering so normalized that endurance seemed natural, inevitable. And in that normalization lay the real control, not the cut itself, but the acceptance of cutting. Not the beating, but the silence afterward. Marriage readiness rituals were never just about marriage. They were about teaching girls, from the first drop of blood to the last public parade, that pain and obedience were not separate from womanhood. They were womanhood. In the ancient world, words weren't harmless. Speech was thought to travel farther than the mouth that shaped it, curling into the air with a weight that could bless or poison. For women, that weight was amplified, dangerous, and in need of constant supervision. A man's words might direct a hunt or declare a law. A woman's, they feared, might summon illness, disrupt fertility, or fracture the fragile balance between humans and gods. Anthropologists note that in many oral cultures, the spoken word wasn't just communication, it was action. To say something was to set it loose, to risk it taking effect. Women's voices, already tied to the mysteries of blood, childbirth, and fertility, carried a double charge, the potential to create and the potential to destroy. A blessing could become a curse with just the wrong inflection. Better then to guard it, limit it, silence it. In some societies, this belief hardened into strict taboos. Among the Dogon of Mali, women's words during menstruation were considered so charged they could disrupt agricultural fertility. In parts of Papua New Guinea, women were forbidden from naming sacred objects or speaking men's ritual names. Even in early Mediterranean traditions, the female voice was trimmed back. In Homeric hymns, women appear as singers of laments or chorus members, rarely as their speech was framed as emotional, excessive, even dangerous if it strayed too far. The fear was that words didn't end at the tongue. They might travel into spirits, seep into ancestors, shift the outcome of a hunt or harvest. And if that outcome turned sour, blame rarely landed on chance. It landed on the woman who had spoken out of turn, talked too freely, and you risked being accused of hexing the cattle, spoiling the crops, or cursing the birth of someone else's child. Silence became not just courtesy, but insurance against accusation. But there was envy folded inside the fear. The association between women and speech often surfaced in ritual roles that men both relied on and distrusted. Women sang laments at funerals, their voices said to guide souls into the afterlife. They whispered charms during childbirth, words believed to ease the passage between worlds. They carried knowledge of herbs, which often came bound to incantations. Men recognized the power, they simply didn't want it roaming free. Better to lock it inside ritual, to give women specific, narrow moments to speak, and forbid them everywhere else. It wasn't just about magic. Controlling women's voices was also a neat political trick. If words shape decisions, then muting half the population ensures the council always echoes the same timbre. Across Africa, Oceania, the Americas, men filled councils and assemblies, while women listened outside. Silence wasn't natural, it was enforced. The myth of dangerous speech gave it teeth. Still, the tension never disappeared. Every time a woman was silenced, it was a reminder that her voice was feared precisely because it mattered. If it truly had no power, there would have been no need for rules, huts, and punishments. Silence was not proof of weakness. It was proof that words, once spoken, were too strong to risk. And this management of speech didn't wait for adulthood. It began with puberty, when a girl's body announced itself as fertile and her tongue, suddenly, was tied to omens. The first blood wasn't just managed in the body, it reshaped the way she was allowed to speak. Puberty didn't only alter the body, it rewrote the mouth. A girl who once sang with others or chatted freely during chores was suddenly expected to draw back into silence. The first blood wasn't just a private sign of fertility, it was a public marker that her words now carried new risks. From that moment, every syllable was monitored. Initiation rites made this transition explicit. Among the Ndembu of Central Africa, girls at monarchy were withdrawn into seclusion huts where silence was demanded. They sat for days or weeks, taught to curb speech, their quietness interpreted as discipline and readiness. Similar practices appeared in the Americas. Among the Ojibwe, menstruating girls were restricted from casual conversation, forbidden to address men directly. Silence was a visible border, separating child from woman. The logic repeated itself across cultures. Speech was seen as unruly, like desire or blood, and needed containment. Puberty framed the perfect moment to impose those restrictions. A girl learning to still her tongue was a girl learning to accept her place in marriage, where silence before elders and husbands was considered virtue. Talking back wasn't teenage rebellion, it was scandal, sometimes even grounds for punishment. Anthropologists studying initiation schools in West Africa recorded how silence was enforced through ritual. Girls were taught songs they could only whisper in groups, never alone, the hushed tone itself a lesson in restraint. Loudness, laughter, even humming could be punished. In some traditions, silence during seclusion was paired with fasting, both meant to train the body to obey external control. A girl who emerged quieter than before was praised for maturity. It wasn't only the spoken word. Eye contact, too, was folded into the category of dangerous expression. A young woman who looked directly at male elders was accused of arrogance, even sorcery. Silence became more than the absence of sound, it was an entire posture, a way of shrinking voice, gaze, and presence into something manageable. And this silence wasn't temporary, it was rehearsal. Once the hut door opened, the lesson followed her into marriage, into markets, into public spaces where her voice had to be measured against the risk of shame. The puberty silence wasn't about protecting her, it was about training her to carry taboos in her throat, to measure her words against consequences. But silence was never entirely empty. In the enforced hush, girls often shared whispers with each other, creating a low, parallel world of female speech. Anthropologists call these hidden transcripts the quiet exchanges, songs and jokes that slipped under the radar of ritual control. They weren't recorded in stone, but they carried knowledge: how to survive childbirth, how to resist husbands in small ways, how to heal with herbs. Even in enforced silence, voices found cracks to seep through. Still, the overriding structure was clear. Puberty was the doorway, and silence was the first rule of entry. From then on, a woman's words were not her own. They were treated as sacred, volatile, dangerous, something to regulate. And nowhere was this regulation sharper than in the monthly cycle itself, when menstruation not only confined the body, but also pressed harder on the voice. Speech during blood was never neutral. It was considered polluting, volatile, or even catastrophic. When the blood returned each month, it carried with it not only seclusion and restrictions on movement, but a fresh clamp on the tongue. Menstruating women were often expected to speak less, or not at all, because words were thought to travel like blood, uncontrolled, contaminating, capable of spoiling whatever they touched. The Dogon of Mali built entire menstrual houses at the edge of their villages. Women stayed there during their cycles, apart from men, apart from fields and shrines. Inside, silence wasn't absolute, but it was demanded in public. Too much talk during bleeding was believed to weaken men's strength or cause crops to fail. In North America, the Ojibwe treated menstrual lodges the same way. Women were separated and discouraged from speaking to hunters or warriors, since their voices could ruin the outcome of a hunt. Silence here wasn't framed as oppression, it was framed as protection. Words during menstruation were volatile, said to disrupt ritual balance. Better to contain them than risk a misstep. The irony was sharp. Women's blood was the essence of fertility, the literal foundation of life, and yet during its flow, their voices were branded as toxic. Rules multiplied around food and fire. In some Pacific societies, menstruating women were forbidden to name certain foods aloud, because a careless word could spoil them. Elsewhere, naming the names of sacred objects or ancestors was forbidden, as if menstrual blood could ride the spoken syllables straight into the world of spirits. A menstruating woman's voice wasn't treated as empty sound, it was treated as a channel, to open, to dangerous. This wasn't only about spiritual balance, it also ensured social control. A woman who couldn't speak in ritual spaces or to men during her period was effectively removed from decision-making. Her body marked her voice as suspect, temporarily invalid. The rules weren't just about blood, they were about power, making sure her words didn't reach places they weren't wanted. The seclusion huts and speech taboos also created a rhythm of exile. Every month, women were physically and verbally pushed aside, their voices muted, their presence diminished. But inside those huts, a different kind of speech flourished. Whispers, jokes, complaints, songs. Women spoke freely to each other, away from men's ears. What was framed as exile often became the only space where women's voices ran unguarded. Still, the taboos stuck. Outside the hut, silence returned, and the cycle of speech suppression repeated itself, month after month. By embedding the restriction in biology, societies ensured it couldn't be avoided. The voice was tethered to the womb. Whenever the womb bled, the tongue was bound, and the binding didn't end with menstruation. During pregnancy and childbirth, speech was also monitored. Words spoken too freely around unborn children were thought to invite spirits, curses, or death. The idea that a woman's voice was too potent to roam unchecked followed her from puberty to pregnancy, from first blood to first birth. Once blood gave way to pregnancy, the rules shifted but didn't soften. A pregnant woman's body was already seen as porous, vulnerable to spirits, to curses, to jealous eyes. Her voice, in that logic, was just as porous. Words could invite harm to the unborn, tempt fate, or draw misfortune into the household. So she was taught to hold her tongue. Across cultures, silence in pregnancy became a form of protection. In parts of West Africa, women were warned not to name the unborn child aloud. Giving the baby a voice too early was said to alert spirits or enemies who might claim it first. Among the Navajo, women avoided certain words and phrases during pregnancy, fearful that careless speech could deform the child or invite bad luck. Even in the Andes, anthropologists recorded taboos around speaking negatively about food or animals. Say the wrong thing, and it might mark the child in the womb. Childbirth carried its own web of restrictions. In many groups, women labored apart, surrounded by midwives, but removed from public hearing. Screams were expected, but words were risky. Naming names, speaking curses, or even calling for certain relatives was thought to entangle the fragile boundary between life and death. Silence wasn't only symbolic, it was a safeguard against drawing the wrong forces into the room. Sometimes the control turned practical. In societies where infant mortality was high, a woman's open lamentation or boasting during pregnancy could later be blamed if the child died. If she had spoken too freely, she was accused of tempting misfortune. Silence reduced risk not of death itself, but of blame. The voice could even become a scapegoat. In some traditions, miscarriages or stillbirths were explained, not by infection or malnutrition, but by speech. Perhaps the mother had spoken harshly to someone, or uttered a forbidden word. Her own voice became evidence against her, proof that she had undone her pregnancy with her tongue. And yet, in private spaces, speech crept back. Women whispered charms over their bellies, muttered prayers to ancestors, or sang low lullabies to the unborn. The same voice that was restricted in public became protective in secret. Power and danger were never truly separate. The same voice that might curse was believed capable of blessing. But the overarching structure remained. A pregnant woman's voice was never neutral. Every word was weighed, policed, filtered. What she could or couldn't say became another layer of control, binding her tighter into silence at the very moment her body was most celebrated. And the lesson carried forward into marriage. If pregnancy demanded silence to protect a child, marriage demanded silence to protect honor. In many traditions, a bride's voice was clipped even further, sometimes for days, sometimes for years, until submission itself became her mother tongue. Marriage wasn't framed as a new beginning for a girl. It was framed as an ending to her voice, or at least to its freedom. Many traditions wrapped the approach to marriage in enforced silence, teaching that the less a bride spoke, the more dignified, obedient, and worthy she appeared. In parts of West Africa, ethnographies recorded brides instructed not to speak to their husbands for the first days or even weeks of marriage. Silence here wasn't awkward, it was ceremonial. Words could come later, carefully measured, but the opening act had to be restrained. Among some indigenous groups of North America, new brides were also kept silent before in-laws, their lowered eyes and closed mouths signaling respect. It was a performance of humility, but one that quickly became habit. The rule spread into ritual language. Among the Kikuyu of Kenya, initiation schools taught girls to lower their voices permanently after marriage, never raising them against elders or husbands. In the Pacific, brides sometimes sat mute during ceremonies while relatives spoke on their behalf. The absence of her voice wasn't oversight, it was the main feature, a declaration that she was being handed over, not only body but tongue. Silence was even enforced through physical acts. In certain marriage preparations, a bride's mouth was symbolically sealed, ashes smeared across lips, cloths tied around the head, or vows of muteness sworn in ritual. These gestures weren't subtle. They marked the bride's transition from a girl with chatter to a woman whose words were rationed. The logic was tidy. A quiet bride was a disciplined bride. She wouldn't shame her husband in public, wouldn't argue with elders, wouldn't speak her desires too plainly. Her silence was a dowry in itself, proof of her training and her submission. Families invested in that silence, because it protected alliances. A talkative woman, after all, could ruin reputations. But there was fear in this too. The worry wasn't only about gossip or disrespect, it was about power. A bride's speech was believed capable of cursing her husband's household if it carried resentment. Better to choke the risk at its root. Better to train her that words belonged to others, and hers were dangerous unless wrapped in deference. Even when she was allowed to speak, her voice often had to pass through intermediaries. Older women might carry her complaints. Relatives might bargain in her place. The bride's silence wasn't just ritual, it was structural, ensuring she didn't enter marriage as a negotiator, only as a participant. Still, silence never held completely. Within the women's quarters, whispers rose again, jokes about husbands, advice on managing in-laws, secret songs sung at grinding stones. Silence was a rule in public, but beneath it a different voice survived, stubborn and low. Yet the public face remained unchanged. At the threshold of marriage, the girl learned that her words were no longer her own. And that threshold was reinforced every month in exile, when menstrual huts and seclusion renewed the lesson that her body and her voice belonged elsewhere. Every society had its borders, and for women, one of the most familiar was the threshold of the menstrual hut. Exile wasn't always a punishment. Often it was ritual. But the effect was the same. A woman's body, and with it her voice, was pushed out of the shared world and tucked away into a corner space reserved for blood and silence. In Mali, the Dogon built these huts at the very edges of villages. Women stayed there during their periods, away from families, fields, and shrines. They cooked separately, slept separately, and spoke separately. Their words were not permitted to mingle with men's work or men's rituals. In native North America, the Ojibwe and other groups created menstrual lodges with the same logic. Blood made women powerful, dangerously so, and seclusion protected everyone else from the spillover. Silence was part of the confinement. The huts often became cramped with contradictions. On the surface, they marked pollution, blood framed as contaminant, women's voices framed as unsafe, but inside, they became spaces of solidarity. Women whispered stories to one another, shared remedies, laughed at men's fears. Anthropologists have described them as both exile and refuge. Yes, they removed women from community decisions, but they also gave them rare stretches of time apart from constant labor. Still, the stigma remained. To be sent to the hut was to be branded temporarily dangerous, even untouchable. Men avoided eye contact. Food cooked, there was sometimes discarded, and words spoken within carried a shadow. The separation turned natural cycles into evidence of difference, reminding everyone month after month that a woman's voice was not equal to a man's, and the huts weren't only for menstruation. In parts of Papua New Guinea, women gave birth in similar lodges, separated from daily life. Their voices, cries, even screams in childbirth were treated as risky, capable of drawing spirits or upsetting ritual order. Silence followed them into labor, not because it was possible, but because it was expected. The repetition of exile carved deep grooves. Girls grew up knowing that every cycle meant removal, that their speech was tethered to their blood. Menstruation wasn't only a biological rhythm, it was a recurring lesson in marginalization. Month after month, they learned that their bodies carried the same verdict. Step aside, lower your voice, vanish. But exile had its unintended consequence. The huts created a parallel world of women's language, separate from men's counsels and rituals. Songs whispered in menstrual lodges, jokes told between women in labor huts, small confidences murmured in exile. These became their own archive of speech, invisible to the larger community, but alive nonetheless. Even so, the power men feared was always projected back as danger. A woman who spoke too loudly during her seclusion might be accused of spoiling a hunt or drawing sickness. Words, again, were branded as volatile, and the silence drilled into exile spilled over into daily life, training women to hold their tongues in public spaces long after the hut door had closed. And once silence was tied to pollution, it was a short step to tie it to something darker: curses, witchcraft. The suspicion that a woman who spoke too freely was not only inappropriate, but lethal. Silence wasn't only about politeness, it was about survival. In many societies, a woman's free speech wasn't just frowned upon, it was feared. Words spoken too quickly, too harshly, or in the wrong moment could be interpreted as sorcery, as a curse loosed into the air. And once a reputation stuck, it was nearly impossible to scrape off. Across sub-Saharan Africa, anthropologists recorded the suspicion that a quarrelsome woman's words could cause sickness in children or weakness in livestock. A sharp tongue wasn't simply a social flaw, it was considered a weapon. Among the Azande of Central Africa, witchcraft was thought to operate unconsciously, through envy or anger, and a woman who spoke with too much bite was an easy target for blame. Misfortune needed a cause, and women's speech offered a convenient scapegoat. The pattern stretched widely. In medieval Europe, women accused of witchcraft were almost always described as talkative or quarrelsome. Gossip became evidence, complaints became curses, and even singing the wrong song at the wrong time could be twisted into proof of diabolical influence. The witch's cauldron was less feared than the witch's tongue. Even outside witch trials, ordinary rituals built in the same fear. In the Andes, pregnant women were told not to speak of animals with deformities, lest their children be born marked. In Oceania, women were forbidden to utter the names of certain men or spirits during menstruation, since their voices could draw down unwanted powers. The theme repeated: women's speech wasn't neutral. It was volatile, unpredictable, and potentially catastrophic. And this fear was political camouflage. By painting women's words as dangerous, male authority could justify silencing them. Councils, rituals, negotiations all remained in men's voices, while women who spoke too loudly risked not just disapproval but accusation. The idea that speech could curse became a handy form of social discipline. A woman didn't need chains if she already feared that her words might betray her. The cruelest part was how everyday emotions became criminalized. Anger, grief, even humor could be twisted into evidence. A widow lamenting too bitterly might be accused of cursing her husband's kin. A mother complaining about food shortages could be blamed if crops failed. A girl mocking elders might suddenly be whispered about as a budding witch. The line between ordinary expression and supernatural danger was kept deliberately vague because vagueness kept women cautious. But of course, whispered accusations didn't erase women's speech. They redirected it. Fears of curses and witchcraft often drove female voices underground, into private spaces. Secret songs, coded jokes. What was forbidden in the public square survived in kitchens, grinding circles, and burial laments. Women's tongues may have been feared, but that fear was never enough to silence them completely. Still, the suspicion clung. Once speech was tied to witchcraft, there was little chance of regaining open ground. Women's voices remained edged with danger, watched for signs of envy, policed for sharpness, punished for being too present. And that suspicion reached right into the heart of politics, where the council fires and ritual assemblies burned without women's voices at all. If silence during menstruation and childbirth kept women on the margins of ritual, silence in politics kept them out of power altogether. Councils, assemblies, and negotiations were where decisions were made, and women's voices were systematically kept from those fires. It wasn't an accident. It was architecture. Across much of Africa, men's councils controlled land, cattle, and war-making. Women might labor in the fields, tend the herds, or manage the household economy. But when disputes were settled or alliances forged, their voices were absent. Anthropologists working among the Tiv and Ashanti noted that even when women held market power, their words were rarely allowed in councils. The logic was circular, because women's speech was already framed as dangerous. Excluding it from politics seemed natural. In Oceania, similar divisions appeared. Men's houses dominated village centers, built as both ritual and political spaces. Women could cook outside them, carry messages into them, but rarely speak within them. The building itself enforced silence. Among the highland groups of Papua New Guinea, female speech in political rituals was considered pollution, capable of weakening decisions or inviting supernatural retaliation. Silence here wasn't just custom, it was law. But the picture wasn't uniform. In matrilineal societies, exceptions flickered. Among the Iroquois, clan mothers wielded authority in choosing and deposing chiefs. Their voices didn't echo in the council fire directly, but they whispered loudly enough to shape decisions. Authority flowed through kinship, and women's influence was preserved in ways outsiders often overlooked. Even so, the rare exceptions stood out precisely because they were exceptions. For most women, political silence was drilled in early. A girl might be told to hush when men were debating cattle disputes, or kept away from ritual gatherings where community decisions were made. Her words belonged in kitchens, not in negotiations. Her advice might be sought privately, even acted on, but the public performance of politics remained a chorus of male voices, and the reasoning was dressed in sacred clothes. Women's speech wasn't excluded because it lacked intelligence, it was excluded because it was deemed too dangerous, too emotional, too connected to the mysteries of fertility. If politics was about balance, then silencing women was framed as protecting that balance. The irony was bitter. The very people whose labor sustained households were erased from the spaces where households' futures were decided. Still, the suppression wasn't absolute. Women found their own ways to bend it. Marketplaces became arenas where they negotiated loudly, their speech woven into trade disputes and bargains. Songs carried criticism, sometimes thinly veiled, sometimes obvious enough to sting. In West Africa, satirical songs sung by women could shame men publicly, a counterweight to formal exclusion. But even those forms of speech carried risk. Too sharp a verse, and accusations of witchcraft or dishonor returned. So political silence functioned as both control and performance. Men ruled with words, women were ruled into silence, and everyone pretended the arrangement was natural. Yet in every whisper, every song, every coded proverb, women's voices still lingered, waiting for spaces where ritual couldn't entirely contain them. And nowhere was this tension more evident than in religion, where divine law itself seemed to insist that a woman's voice could chant softly in the background, but never lead the prayer. Religion, more than politics, wrapped silence in gold leaf. If councils barred women's words from law, temples barred them from heaven's ear. In many traditions, the voice itself was sacred property, and women's tongues were treated as off-limits for direct dialogue with the divine. In Vedic India, ritual chants, the mantras that carried the universe, were restricted to men. Women could attend ceremonies, but their voices were absent from the hymns. Silence here was reframed as purity. By keeping women's mouths closed, priests claimed the order of the cosmos remained intact. The same pattern surfaced in early Christianity, where Paul's letters were quoted endlessly. Women must keep silent in church. It wasn't just advice, it was canon. Across the Islamic world, the divide hardened differently. Women could pray, but their voices in the mosque were discouraged from rising above whispers. The male call to prayer echoed over cities, structuring the day, while female devotion remained tucked indoors, unseen and unheard. Here again, voice was framed as temptation, as distraction, as something that pulled men away from God. Silence in ritual wasn't always absolute. In some traditions, women were given space to sing laments or perform funerary dirges. Ancient Greece preserved this most vividly. Women's cries carried the dead to the underworld, their wails thought to bridge the human and the divine. But even there, the space was policed. Too much lamentation, too many words, and they were accused of stirring chaos, of calling up the wrong spirits. Their role was tolerated, never trusted. Anthropologists often note that women's ritual silence wasn't about incompetence, it was about containment. The female voice was believed too potent to risk in sacred speech. If it carried fertility, desire, and curse, then letting it echo in temples could destabilize the entire order. Better to hush it, restrict it, or allow it only in controlled bursts. Laments at funerals, whispers at childbirth, low chants in women-only spaces. The irony was that in private religion, women's voices never stopped. They murmured prayers over food, whispered charms into children's ears, sang lullabies thick with theology. They carried oral traditions that priests never wrote down. Silence was ritual theater, but daily life was filled with women's devotional speech, recorded, unnoticed, but persistent. Still, the stage remained male. Public devotion belonged to men, and women's silence was treated as proof of obedience, of submission, of cosmic order. Every hush, every bowed head, every withheld word was framed not as absence, but as virtue. And yet, the silencing didn't end at the temple gate. It bled back into daily life, reinforcing that a woman's words were safest when unspoken. Religion sanctified what politics demanded, what seclusion enforced, what huts rehearsed. The circle closed neatly. Silence became sacred. But silence was also a strategy. Women learned to survive inside it, bending it into a shield. Because if speaking openly drew suspicion, sometimes whispering in the shadows was the only way to keep knowledge alive. Silence was a leash, but it was also a tool. Women didn't choose the rules, but they learned to use them. A quiet mouth could mean submission in the council, but in the kitchen or the lodge, that same silence meant secrecy, protection, even power. What was cast as voicelessness often became the cover under which other voices survived. Anthropologists call it the hidden transcript, the whispers, songs, and coded proverbs that circulated out of men's hearing. A lullaby could carry herbal knowledge, a funeral chant could slip in political criticism, a joke muttered at the grinding stone could expose the absurdity of the elders' rules. Women rarely spoke freely in public, but they weren't mute. They simply shifted their speech into spaces where it couldn't be punished. In some places, silence itself became resistance. Among the Dogon, refusing to answer questions during seclusion was framed as ritual discipline. But it also gave women control over when and how they re-entered society. In West African markets, women who were formerly excluded from councils still used collective silence as protest, refusing to sell, refusing to speak to men until grievances were heard. What began as enforced muteness could be flipped, turned into a weapon of collective bargaining. The paradox deepened in households. A wife who stayed quiet in front of her husband often spoke volumes with silence, refusing to answer, refusing to look up, letting the absence of words hang heavier than speech. Silence, trained as submission, became a language of its own, one that men often pretended not to understand but always noticed. Still, the cost was steep. Generations of women were disciplined into quiet, their voices clipped from ritual, politics, and public life. Silence shrank possibilities. It erased testimony, concealed dissent, and disguised suffering. In courts, women's words were often inadmissible. In religion, they were considered impure. In politics, irrelevant. Silence became so naturalized it felt inevitable, like weather, and yet it never was. The sheer effort spent building huts, writing laws, and chanting rules about women's voices proves that people knew silence was not natural, it had to be enforced. Which means the opposite was always possible, always threatening. So women carried silence like a double-edged tool. It bound them, yes, but it also hid them. It erased them, but it preserved them. Silence could be oppression, but it could also be strategy, the space in which forbidden speech survived long enough to be passed down. And in that sense, every hush wasn't just an absence. It was a murmur, low and steady, running underneath the noise of councils and rituals. A reminder that voices never vanish completely. They simply change their register, waiting for anyone willing to listen.